Good morning, everybody. I am so excited to be here with y'all today. We have a lot of ground to cover, so let's just go ahead and get right into it. As John said, my name is Stef, and I am currently an intelligence analyst at Canary. I've been there for about a year and a half. It's been awesome. Before that, I spent an equally awesome 2 years at Mandiant as a digital forensics and incident response consultant. Before that, before I even got into cybersecurity, I got my master's in clinical psych. So if you've seen some of my other SANS talks, you know I love nerding out about psych stuff, although we're not going to do that as much today. And I've come to terms with the fact that my favorite hobby is actually picking up new hobbies. And so my latest project is I'm setting up a glass lamp working studio in my garage. Glass lamp working is like you use a hand torch to make glass beads and things like that. It's good. It's good, nerdy fun. Speaking of good, nerdy fun, we are going to just dive right into our topic with our bottom line up front. So initial execution techniques are, in a sense, the place where the game is played. I don't want to say that it's a game, but it's the opening moves of this back and forth between analysts and adversaries. And because of that, it's also a place where there are a lot of changes and updates. It can be hard to keep up with those. But if you can keep up with those initial execution changes, you get more detection time, which is great. As much lead time as you can get is fantastic. If you can get enough lead time, you can actually get out in front of malicious payloads before they get dropped on your system. That's ideal. If you can detect the thing that's dropping the malware before the malicious payload even gets a chance to be downloaded or gets a chance to execute, that's awesome. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today, about using open source intelligence to help you keep up to date with the latest changes. And some of the examples I have for you today of opportunities for detecting these initial execution techniques and kind of what we can do with that, how we can maximize that for better detection. So let's, especially for those of you who might be new to cybersecurity, let's kind of zoom out and talk about where we're at in the attack kill chain or the attack life cycle. So you've got this initial access methodology. We've seen some updates over the years. There aren't as many changes. You know, we do have some newer things like SEO poisoning. Phishing is still really common. USBs are still really common. Do not sleep on the USBs. I know y'all might give me some pushback on that, but it's the truth. Anyway, there's only so many ways that adversaries can kind of reach out and connect to potential victim systems. It's what happens next that we're going to be talking about. We're talking about that first behavioral execution that we see on the system after that initial access technique is successful. So we're talking about crypters, we're talking about droppers, and we're talking about loaders. Because if we can detect those and stop them, then we also stop the follow-on activity, which can be everything else in the attack life cycle or in the cyber kill chain. You know, persistence, lateral movement, network communications, both for downloading additional stages of malware, for C2 communications. We can stop all of that before it starts. That's the ideal. I like to make sure we're all on the same page, and so we all know what we're talking about when I use these words. So let's do some definitions real quick. A crypter is a type of software that, as the name suggests, is used to encrypt and package payloads in a way that makes them much harder to detect. A dropper, and this is the technical definition, we will get into more detail about droppers. A dropper is technically a self-contained application that is able to drop a payload and does not need additional network connections or additional resources to deliver and execute a payload. And a loader could be software, it could be a script, it could be something like a shortcut file. It's used by adversaries to download additional malicious content from remote resources. So this is reaching out to malicious infrastructure on the internet and pulling back additional payloads or maybe additional stages of the same piece of malware. We're going to talk about an example for each of these things. These are not all together. So I'm not talking about one example where we've seen all of these things happen. These are 3 separate examples for each of these categories. I'm going to start off with crypter, which I'm very excited about. I'm excited about all of them. We're going to talk about loader for droppers. There's an asterisk. Again, we'll get into that. And then for loaders, we're going to talk about a threat group or a couple of threat groups and the payload, their favorite payload that they like to load, which is Qbot. All right, let's talk about crypter. All right, so about not a month ago, in February, I was doing detection review. So it's where we go back and the Intel analysts actually take a separate look at our detections to see what all the trends are, to see what's happening in our customer's environment. And I saw this really suspicious scheduled task with the task name Nathafos. I was like, oh, that's weird. There wasn't a whole lot else in the detection. And this is really unique. That one word is very unique. So I decided to do a very super technical technique, and I Googled Nathafos and actually came back with something. I was expecting to come back with an example, but I did. Joe Sandbox had a sample that had been submitted that included that same task name in the execution. I was like, oh, okay, all right, that's cool. And Joe Sandbox said that it was async-rat or DC-rat, which is essentially a copy of async-rat. And these are remote access tools or Trojans that adversaries use to, conduct additional follow-on activity and connect to victim systems. But this doesn't look like async-rat. If you've seen async-rat, this doesn't look like initial async-rat execution. So I'm like, okay, all right, let's Google some more. So I did. I Googled the whole scheduled tasks command at this point, because even though this is not super unique on its own, I was kind of getting the vibes that there was something like hard-coded going on. And I found another sample, except this one had naphthanasia as the task name. And Joe Sandbox said it was Redline. Redline's a stealer. This also does not look like initial Redline execution. And at this point, I'm like, all right, we've got to talk to the canaries. We've got to go ask the canary hive mind what might be going on here, which is what I did. This is actually excerpts from our Slack conversation about this behavior. So I started asking, what is it? I suspected this was something that was delivering async-rat and Redline and maybe some other stuff. Katie immediately hit on it being a crypter. She's done a whole separate talk of her own on crypters. And Tony Lambert, who's one of our wonderful malware analysts, recognized the scheduled task name as being a pattern. So this is why it's wonderful to have a team that you can go back and talk with about some of these things. And so Tony realized that we had seen this in other environments. We had not split it out as separate from the payloads, but we had seen these kinds of weird task names before. And we'd seen it deliver rimcoast rat, bitrat, and njrat. And so, okay, all right, this is really interesting. We were kind of building up the number of payloads that we've seen this thing, whatever it is, deliver. And this is my one not free query that I'm including in here, mostly just to kind of tell y'all how prevalent it is. But if you have VirusTotal Enterprise, you can do these kinds of behavioral searches. I looked for all of these task names that we had found. And a week ago, there were over 6,000 samples that had been uploaded to VirusTotal of this thing, this crypter, delivering a bunch of different stealers and rats. So we decided to call it crypter because of the scheduled task names. And I think this is actually the first time we're talking about crypter, but this is how we track it internally at Red Canary. Tony dove in and did a bunch of analysis on a sample. We're going to try to stay out of the deep weeds, but It does encrypt plain text strings with this AES implementation that was published in 2003 by Ivan Medvedev. I mention that because that sometimes comes up in these null crypter samples in the file metadata. And so that's one hint that if you're looking at similar activity, it may be null crypter. Not necessarily, because again, this is an implementation that was published 20 years ago. It creates these scheduled tasks with hard-coded names and then injects final payloads into a process using process hollowing, which is a very popular technique. And the other thing I want to mention, if you're interested in looking at crypter samples, is these things are padded, massively padded. And there's a reason for that. They add all these extra megabytes of data to confound automated sandboxes. The files will be too big for the sandbox to ingest, so it won't fire off anything if you've got automated sandbox processing. So if you want to take a look at crypter, you're going to have to remove the null byte padding on these samples for those that do want to get deeper into the weeds. But we're going to go ahead and talk about the detection opportunities. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the philosophy of this. Because when you're looking at detection opportunities for these kinds of behaviors that change really rapidly, you can look for behaviors, which is, I think, a really robust way to go. You can look for specifics, so specific task names, or specific types of task names, or you can look for details. And the balance is between accuracy, durability, and what my colleague Jeff likes to call brittleness. So something like this pseudo-analytic that I mentioned here, so scheduled tasks, executing binaries from this unusual folder, this app data roaming folder, is the kind of thing that not only will it detect crypter behavior, it will also detect potentially other types of malware. And the nice thing is it doesn't depend on the task name. So as you start getting more specific, you also get more brittle. You could create analytics with some regex looking for random task names. It actually detects a really wide range of different threats that do use suspicious, randomly named tasks for persistence. But you also get a lot of noise. It's super noisy. So you're going to have to tune it a great deal. And then you can also look for these task names. The bad thing about those are if crypter turns into crypter, you're not going to have that same kind of detection capability anymore. So just to sort of think about as you are looking at these early behaviors, how early can you go in the execution chain? How early can you go and still have it be reliable and useful in the long term? Final thoughts on crypter. So this is my favorite example today, or my most robust example today of these concepts that I really want to have y'all go home with, which is, first of all, that you can learn a lot with free resources. Initially, I didn't look into any proprietary details. I did some Googling. I know Google is not OSINT, but it is a tool. Search engines are a tool that you can use to point you in a direction, especially if you're familiar with them, if you're not as familiar with some other more advanced tools. It was a great reminder not to make assumptions. We tend in the industry to look at all of the behavior as one monolithic piece of malware, and that's not always the case. As we can see, sometimes you've got these different modular pieces that you can split apart. And I think that there's value in that. I think there's value in tracking them separately and treating them as separate sets of behavior that could potentially have their own sets of detections. As we're going to say a lot today, detecting crypter early, it really helps prevent payload execution, which is fantastic. Like we said, if you can prevent red light and async rat from even showing up on your system, that's awesome. And also, the other nice thing is not only do you get that faster detection coverage, but you also get broader coverage. Now you've got this behavior that detects or this analytic that detects behavior even earlier to supplement any specific detection coverage you might have for things like rats or stealers. You get that extra little heads up, which is really helpful. All the time that you can have is time that is useful and worth having. All right. That was very detailed. That was in the weeds. I know that this is a lot of content, but as was mentioned earlier, these slides are going to be available for you later. So don't worry, you'll be able to go back. I'll make sure you have access to especially the detection opportunities after this talk. We are going to zoom out a little bit to take a little bit of a mental breather. And we're going to talk about droppers and Qbot loader, or goo, sorry, not Qbot, goo loader. So as I was researching this, I thought I would find more examples of droppers. Droppers are more, they are in use. I thought I would find more examples of them specifically as kind of that initial execution and that initial payload delivery. The first thing I found out was that according to the internet, this is the deal, all right? Literally everyone uses the word dropper and loader interchangeably. Which is fine, because as we're going to talk about, they describe something putting evil on a system. But technically, they are different. So technically, they are these self-contained applications. Now, it's become much more common to see a loader downloading a dropper. So droppers have gone from being these Trojans. From much early on in the field of cybersecurity, we would see these large Trojans that were dropped and able to execute on their own. Now we're seeing loaders downloading the droppers, and they're much more common as like second and third stage payloads. There's a few reasons for that. Self-contained programs are large. They're easier to detect. A lot of early analytics had to do with suspicious file sizes, and so they just fell out of fashion for that reason, among others. Shout out to the pyramid of pain. Loader scripts are cheap in a sense. They're much less painful for adversaries to retool. Programs that have dependencies, it's a lot trickier to make sure that they're still able to execute after you change them. Loader scripts, you can change a few details and might still be able to evade detection. Also, successful loader execution for the adversary indicates an environment that might be more vulnerable. So they're not committing to this full deployment of all of their evil if they don't know that it won't be successful. It saves them time and resources. So after all that, do the words really matter when we say dropper and loader? Yes and no. It's good to know that technically they are different. But words are all about communicating, right? And effective communication. Both mean this puts malware onto a system. So, we're not going to get too hung up on it. I use the words interchangeably. And as part of the dropper section, because I would like to have an example for all of these, we're going to talk about a more dropper-ish loader. It is still a loader, but it is a little more self-contained than some of the other loaders that we're seeing. We're going to talk about goo loader, also known as Cloud Eye. All right, so goo loader is used to distribute shellcode and deliver follow-on payloads. We've seen Remco Rat and Age of Tesla. Some other folks have seen Formbook, Qbot, lots more. It's delivered via phishing emails, like a lot of these initial execution and payload loaders and droppers. And it's typically a malicious attachment that's included in the phishing email. Goo loader is pretty self-contained for a loader, like I mentioned. So you do have an initial Visual Basic script, a VBS script file that downloads into a registry key for persistence and then reaches out to infrastructure to deliver the next stage. The next stage, the next few pieces are very kind of contained. So the next stage will perform these anti-analysis checks and inject shellcode into memory. If the analysis checks are successful, the anti-analysis checks, then the shellcode will download that final payload and execute it. That payload being, again, Rimcoast Rat, Agent Tesla, lots of others. So, like with crypter, detecting bootloader activity early or mitigating it in some way helps prevent those final payloads from being executed. Because bootloader on its own, it's not as harmful as a lot of, or high risk, I guess I should say, as a lot of the payloads that it's ultimately delivering. I love talking about this mitigation technique. Now, this is something that, again, don't worry about capturing all of this because it is going to be more complicated and you will need to go back and reference the details for how to do this. But we published a blog earlier in the year during tax season about bootloader and one of the ways that you can mitigate it. This is awesome if it works for you, something to consider. If you can create a group policy object to change default behaviors for scripts, potentially malicious scripts and how they open, like VBS, for example, if you can make them open as text files in Notepad, they don't execute. That's it. You kind of cut it off at the knees, which is wonderful. Again, you're going to need to test this and roll this out slowly. But something to consider, does everyone in your environment need to be able to execute all kinds of scripts at all times? Maybe not, something to think about. This also works for other types of malware families that use a similar technique. But I do want to include a behavioral detection opportunity as well, because we're all about detecting those behaviors as early as possible. So early on in bootloader execution, WScript will launch PowerShell and download and execute a payload. This is something that you're going to have to tune if you decide to use something similar, because there might be legitimate applications in your environment that do this. But it's an opportunity, and it will also detect other malware families that do this other than bootloader. So final thoughts on droppers and on bootloader. So technically, droppers and loaders are different, but everyone in the industry seems to use the words interchangeably, and both are used to deliver follow-on payloads. So just something to keep in mind, especially if you're newer to cybersecurity, these words are not really used as different things anymore. Bootloader is used by adversaries to download and execute various payloads. So like crypter, early bootloader detection can prevent those final payloads from being delivered and executed. And another option to supplement any early behavioral detection could be this script mitigation, could be changing default behavior so these malicious scripts don't execute. All right, we're rocking through it. So here we come to part 3, which is our section on loaders. And like I said, we're going to talk about these threat groups and Qbot, which is their favorite payload. All right, so in case you have not been formally introduced to TA570 and TA577, they're initial access brokers and malware distribution groups named by Proofpoint. They do large-scale malicious phishing campaigns. TA570 is known as the president's affiliate because they keep track of their specific campaigns using campaign IDs with US president names in them in the malware configuration. So in the configuration of these loaders that they use to then deliver Qbot, which is what they typically deliver. Sometimes they deliver ICE ID, but that's much, much less frequent. TA577, also known as the letters affiliate, because they use letter pairs in their campaign ID configuration. They used TR for a long time, but as you can see, they've used others. BB30 is one of the more recent examples. They typically distribute Qbot, but they've also delivered several other malware families. So again, if we can detect their initial loaders, then we'll be able to prevent, or at least hopefully get a lead on responding to some of this other activity. Because some of these threats, like Qbot, are very fast acting and high risk. If y'all know me at all or follow me on Twitter, I hate Qbot so much. It's also known as a quackbot. It was our #1 most commonly seen threat last year. It's been active since at least 2009. It is a potential ransomware precursor, although initially it started off as a banking Trojan. And you can see why adversaries like it. It has a ton of features and it can do some really useful things for them, like automated domain and network reconnaissance. It will set up a bunch of C2 infrastructure or C2 connections automatically. It's very noisy once it gets going. And the thing about Qbot is that Qbot itself, so we're talking about really splitting these things apart, the thing that loads Qbot from Qbot. Qbot has changed comparatively little compared to the loaders that are used to deliver it. The loaders, however, have gone through a lot of cycles and a lot of changes. So this is looking at Qbot activity over the last couple of years. So we can kind of track TA570 and TA577 campaigns with the amount of Qbot that we're seeing. Although we have started tracking these as distinct now, which is, I think, going to be really, really useful. So they operate in cycles, as you can see. They have really intense activity. They'll go to pretty quiet, near dormancy. And they change their loader initial access techniques and TTPs a lot in an attempt to evade detection. There's good evidence or some theories that they do development cycles. So they actually test out new TTPs and techniques between campaigns to see what will be most effective. But within campaigns, there will also be a ton of changes, sometimes like within the day. We saw that a lot last June and last October during some big Qbot campaigns, especially now that macros aren't leveraged anymore. They're experimenting wildly with different types of scripts and different types of file extensions. All of that said, I promise, you can detect these rapidly changing affiliate TTPs before Qbot payloads are delivered. You can, and we're going to talk about some specifics for that. So this is one of my favorite examples for the security community and open source intelligence really helping defenders. There is a community of malware analysts that shares their analysis on Twitter and on the internet. Proxy Life is one researcher that shares a ton of details, not only on Qbot, but they also, as you can see, have a Qbot repo. And so you don't have to do the analysis yourself. Of course you can, but Proxy Life and other researchers will update folks with sometimes, up to the hour information about the latest new behaviors and the different versions of TA570 and TA577 loaders. So this is an example from April 2023, so earlier this year. I'm going to show you kind of a previous example and then a more current example to give you an example of some of these changes that they make over time. So this is the president's affiliate. The attack flow was phishing email delivering a malicious PDF, and then you've got different associated downloads in an attempt to evade mark of the web detections. You've got zip files, you've got that WScript file, you've got a really interesting XML HTTP command, and then of course you've got the Qbot DLL that executes ultimately. So I want you to kind of pay attention to this attack flow, and I'll pop back to this slide in a second because it changed a good bit. So this is the beginning of June. I think there's actually a more recent campaign that has started in the last few days, but you can go to Proxy Life's GitHub repo and you can check out the details if you're curious about that. So as you can see, we've gone to JavaScript and MSI instead of that XML HTTP request to actually reach out and pull down that Qbot DLL. So again, here's April, here's June with those new JavaScript and MSI files, but you've still got the initial malicious PDF. There's still patterns here. You've still got the zip. You've still got this WScript execution that they were also doing in April from this really sus folder. Qbot operators really like app data local folders. So that's a good piece of, that's something good to key off of as far as suspicious patterns. And you've still got suspicious run DLL 32 execution from, again, this really suspicious folder. So there are ways of keeping an eye out for these suspicious behaviors that will let you get a little bit of lead time before the payload is downloaded and executed. Here's a TA577 example. A little bit different than TA570. Sometimes there's a lot of overlap. Sometimes they diverge a little bit more. So this example, it was really interesting. The malicious JavaScript that was downloaded from that URL delivered in the phishing email was really heavily obfuscated. And the JavaScript would ultimately deobfuscate into a PowerShell command, reaching out and pulling down that Qbot DLL. This is the thing that I want you to note as being very different in the next slide. So as we come to the beginning of June, you can see the process execution is very different, which is that bottom section. So like before, I'll pop back to the last one and then to this one. So here's June, the most recent. Here's May. Looks very different. But again, there are still details that you can track. Like, yes, now there's a malicious PDF that you see before the URL. There's a malicious zip file now, but there's still the malicious URL. There's still the malicious network communication. There's still a JavaScript file that's being used. You've got wscript.exe execution from app data local, which is a nice overlap with TA570. You've got, again, still that run DLL 32 execution from a suspicious location. So there are ways of keeping up with the latest changes, especially if you use OSINT to help you with this, which gives you a leg up on detecting Qbot before it's delivered, which is important. Qbot is very fast moving and it is high risk since it has been seen delivering ransomware in the past. So the more lead time you get to isolate that system, the better. You got to keep in mind that TA570 and TA577 frequently change their TTPs as often as daily, sometimes, especially in the middle of big campaigns. But if you follow trusted community sources, you get a huge advantage in being able to stay out in front of this from a detection perspective. And that speedy initial access detection really helps reduce Qbot risk, which is fantastic and is our goal. All right, so as we come to the end of our content, what are our key takeaways? Let's go back to that bottom line that we had earlier. As we talked about today, initial execution techniques are very frequently changed and updated because those changes and updates, that detection evasion, gives adversaries a lot of bang for their buck. But if you can stay out in front of it, if you can keep up with it and have that earlier detection, that gives you extra time to respond. And that rapid response can, in some cases, completely stop or mitigate those follow-on payloads, that follow-on activity, before it even begins on your system. And open source intelligence is hugely helpful for this because we do have a wonderful security community that does share a lot of information with each other. Here are my favorite OSINT resources. I don't want to be all like, hey, OSINT's great, and then not give you details. So again, don't try to copy all of this. I'm going to put these lists out on my LinkedIn and on Twitter right after this talk, but I have a list of my favorite malware researchers and CTI analysts that I follow on Twitter. Search engines are really helpful. VirusTotal is great. I use the abuse.ch resources a ton, especially Malware Bazaar and URL House. Love Joe Sandbox and other publicly available sandbox samples. CyberChef is awesome. If you haven't played with CyberChef, 2 thumbs up, because especially if you're interested in doing some of your own research on some of these, especially these scripts that are used, it can be incredibly helpful for that. And there's lots more options. If you have favorite OSINT resources that I haven't mentioned here, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We've got a lot of awesome folks hanging out today. And with that, I would like to thank you for joining us today. Really, really delighted to be here with you.